Page 432, Chapter 11, The Supreme Measure. Capital punishment has had an up-and-down history in Russia. In the code of the Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich Romanov, there were 50 crimes for which capital punishment could be imposed. By the time of the military statutes of Peter the Great, there were 200. Yet the Empress Elizabeth, while she did not repeal those laws authorizing capital punishment, never once resorted to it. They say that when she ascended to the throne, she swore an oath to never execute anyone, and for all 20 years of her reign she kept that oath. She fought the 7 Years' War, yet she still got along without capital punishment. It was an astounding record in mid-18th century, 50 years before the guillotine of the Jacobins. True, we have taught ourselves to ridicule our past. We never acknowledge a good deed or a good intention in our history. And one can very easily blacken Elizabeth's reputation too. She replaced capital punishment with flogging, with the knout, tearing out nostrils, branding with the word thief, an eternal exile in Siberia. But let us also say something on behalf of the Empress. How could she have changed things more radically than she did in contravention of the social concepts of her time? And perhaps a prisoner condemned to death today would voluntarily consent to that whole complex of punishments if only the sun would continue to shine on him. But we in our humanitarianism did not offer him that chance, and perhaps the leader will come to feel in the course of this book that 20 or even 10 years in our camps are harder to bear than were the punishments of Elizabeth. In today's terms, Elizabeth had an universally human point of view on all this, while the Empress Catherine the Great had, on the contrary, a class point of view, which was consequently more correct. Not to execute anyone at all seemed to her appalling and indefensible. She found capital punishment entirely appropriate in defending herself, her throne, and her system. In other words, in political cases such as those of Mirovich, the Moscow Plague Mutiny, and Pugachev. But for habitual criminals, for non-political offenders, why not consider capital punishment abolished? Under Paul, the abolition of capital punishment was confirmed. Despite his many wars, there were no military tribunals attached to military units. And during the whole long reign of Alexander I, capital punishment was introduced only for war crimes that took place during a campaign, 1812. Right at this point, some people will say to us, what about deaths from running the gauntlet? Yes, indeed, there were those, of course, hidden executions. For that matter, one can literally drive a person to death with a trade union meeting. But the yielding up of one's God-given life because others, sitting in judgment, have so voted simply did not take place in our country, even for crimes of state for an entire half-century, from Pugachev to the Decembrists. The blood of the 5 Decembrists whetted the appetite of our state. From then on, execution for crimes of state was no longer prohibited, nor was it forgotten. Right up to the February Revolution in 1917, it was confirmed by the statutes of 1845 and 1904, and further reinforced by the criminal statutes of the Army and the Navy. And how many people were executed in Russia during that period? We have already, in Chapter 8 above, cited the figures given by liberal leaders of 1905 and 1907 to 1907. Let us add them to the verified figures of Ch.11, the expert on Russian criminal law. Up until 1905, the death penalty was an exceptional measure in Russia. For a period of 30 years, from 1876 to 1904, the period of the Narodnaya Volya revolutionaries, and the use of terrorism, a terrorism which did not consist merely of intentions murmured in the kitchen of a communist apartment, a period of mass strikes and peasant revolts, the period when the parties of the future revolution were created and grew in strength. 486 people were executed, in other words, about 17 people per year for the whole country. This figure includes executions of ordinary non-political criminals. During the years of the First Revolution, 1905, and its suppression, the number of executions rocketed upward, astounding Russian imaginations, calling forth tears from Tolstoy and indignation from Korolenko and many, many others. From 1905 through 1908, about 2,200 persons were executed, 45 a month. This, as Techents have said, was an epidemic of executions, and it came to an abrupt end. When the provisional government came to power, it abolished capital punishment entirely. In July 1917, however, it was reinstated in the active army and frontline areas for military crimes, murder, rape, assault, and pillage, very widespread to those areas at the time. This was one of the most unpopular of the measures which destroyed the provisional government. The Bolshevik slogan before the Bolshevik coup d'etat was "Down with capital punishment," reinstated by Kerensky. A story has come down to us that on the night of October 25th, 26th, a discussion arose in Smolny as to whether one of the first decrees should be the abolition of capital punishment in perpetuity, whereupon Lenin justly ridiculed the idealism of his comrades. He, at any rate, knew that without capital punishment there would be no movement whatever in the direction of the new society. However, in forming a coalition government with the left socialist revolutionaries, gave in to their faulty concepts, and on October 28, 1917, capital punishment was abolished. Nothing good, of course, could come from that goody-goody position. Yes, and how did they get rid of it? At the beginning of 1918, Trotsky ordered that Alexei Chansky, a newly appointed admiral, be brought to trial because he had refused to scuttle the Baltic fleet. Karklin, the chairman of the Victory, quietly sentenced him in broken Russian to be shot within 24 hours. There was a stir in the hall, but it had been abolished. Prosecutor Krylenko explained, "What are you worrying about? Executions have been abolished, but Chansky is not being executed, he is being shot," and they did shoot him. If we are to judge by official documents, capital punishment was restored in all its force in June 1918. No, it was not restored. Instead, a new era of executions was inaugurated. If one takes the view that Laxi is not deliberately understanding the real figures but simply lacks complete information, and the Rev tribunals carried on approximately the same amount of judicial work as the Checker performed in an extrajudicial way, one concludes that in 20 central provinces of Russia, in a period of 16 months, June 1918 to October 1919, more than 6,000 persons were shot, which is to say more than 1,000 a month. This, incidentally, is why they shot both Khrushchev Nazar, the chairman of the 1905 St. Petersburg Soviet, the first Russian Soviet, and the artist who just designed the legendary uniform worn by the Red Army throughout the Civil War. However, It might not even have been these individual executions, with or without formally pronounced death sentences, which added up to thousands and inaugurated the new era of executions in 1918 that stunned and froze Russia. Still more terrible to us was the practice, initially followed by both warring sides and later by the victors only, of sinking barges loaded with unaccounted, unregistered hundreds, unidentified even by a roll call. Naval officers in the Gulf of Finland, in the White, Caspian, and Black Seas, and, as late as 1920, hostages in Lake Baikal. This is outside the scope of our narrow history of courts and trials, but it belongs to the history of morals, which is where everything else originates as well. In all our centuries, from the first Rurik on, had there ever been a period of such cruelties and so much killing as during the post-October Civil War? We would omit from you one of the characteristic ups and downs of the Russian capital punishment story if we neglected to mention the capital punishment was abolished in January 1920. Yes, indeed, and some students of the subject might conceivably be at a loss to interpret the credulity and helplessness of a dictatorship that deprived itself of its avenging sword when Denikin was still in the Kuban, Wrangel still in Crimea, and the Polish cavalry were saddling up for a campaign. But in the first place, the decree was quite sensible. It did not extend to the decisions of military tribunals, but applied only to extrajudicial actions of the Cheka, and the decisions of tribunals in the rear. In the second place, the way was prepared for it by first cleaning out the prisons, by the wholesale execution of prisoners who might otherwise have come under the decree. And in the third place, it was in effect for a brief period, 4 months. It lasted only until the prisons had filled up again. By a decree of May 28, 1920, capital punishment was restored to the Cheka. The revolutions had hastened to rename everything, so that everything would seem new. Thus the death penalty was rechristened the supreme measure, no longer a punishment, but a means of social defense. From the groundwork of the criminal legislation of 1924, it is clear that the supreme measure was introduced only temporarily, pending its total abolition by the All-Russian Central Executive Committee. And in 1927, they actually did begin to abolish it. It was retained solely for crimes against the state and the army, Article 58, and military crimes, and true for banditry also. But the broad political interpretation of banditry was also well known then as it is now, from a Central Asian Basmak right up to the Lithuanian forest guerrillas. Every armed nationalist who doesn't agree with the central government is a bandit. And how could one possibly get along without this article? Simply, any participant in a camp rebellion and any participant in an urban rebellion is also a bandit. But where articles protecting private individuals were concerned, capital punishment was abolished to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the Revolution. And for the 15th anniversary, the law of 7/8 was added to the roster of capital punishment, the law so vitally important to advancing socialism, which guaranteed the Soviet subject a bullet for each crumb stolen from the state's table. As always happens at the start, they hurried to apply the law in 1932-33 and shocked people with special ferocity during the Ukrainian famine. In this time of peace, in December 1932, while Kirov was still alive, at one time, 265 condemned prisoners were awaiting execution in Leningrad's crusty prison alone, and during the whole year, it would certainly seem that more than 1,000 were shot in custody alone. And what kind of evildoers were these condemned men? Where did so many plotters and troublemakers come from? Among them, for example, were 6 collective farmers from nearby Tsarskoye Selo, who were guilty of the following crime. After they had finished mowing the collective farm with their own hands, they had gone back and mowed a second time along the hummocks to get a little hay for their own cows. The All-Russian Central Executive Committee refused to pardon all 6 of these peasants, and the sentence of execution was carried out. The cruel and evil Salchika was what utterly repulsive and infamous serf owner would have killed 6 peasants for their miserable little clippings of hay. If one dared to beat them with birch switches even once, we would know about it and read about it in school and curse the name. But now, heave the corpses into the water, and pretty soon the surface is all smooth again and no one's the wiser. And one must cherish the hope that someday documents will confirm the report of my witness, who is still alive, even if Stalin had killed no others. I believe he deserved to be drawn and quartered just for the lives of those 6 Tsarskoye Selo peasants. And yet they still dare to shriek at us from Peking, from Tirana, from Tbilisi. Yes, and plenty of big bellies in the Moscow suburbs are doing it too. How could you dare expose him? How could you dare disturb his great shade? Stalin belongs to the world communist movement. But in my opinion, he belongs to all he belongs to is a criminal code. Peoples of all the world remember him as a friend, but not those on whose backs he rode, whom he slashed with his note. However, let us return to being dispassionate and impartial once more. Of course, the All-Russian Central Executive Committee would certainly have completely abolished the supreme measure, as promised, but unfortunately what happened was, in 1936, the father and teacher completely abolished the All-Russian Central Executive Committee itself, and the Supreme Soviet that succeeded it had an 18th century ring. The supreme measure became a punishment once again, and ceased to be some kind of incomprehensible social defense. Even to the Stalinist era, the executions of 37-38 could hardly fit into any framework of defense. What legal expert, what criminal historian will provide us with the verified statistics for those 1937-38 executions? Where is that special archive we might be able to penetrate in order to read the figures? There is none. There is none, and there never will be any. Therefore, we dare report only those figures mentioned in rumors that were quite fresh in 39-40, when they were drifting about around under the Butyrki arches, having emanated from the high and middle-ranking Yezhov men of the NKVD, who had been arrested and had passed through those cells not long before. And they really knew. The Yezhov men said that during those years of 37-38, 500,000 political prisoners had been shot throughout the Soviet Union, and 480,000 Blatnia habitual thieves in addition. The thieves were all shot under Article 59.3 because they constituted a basis of Yagoda's power, and thereby the ancient and noble companionship of thieves was pruned back. How improbable are these figures? Take into consideration that the mass executions went on not for 2 full years, but only for a year and a half. We would have to assume under Article 58, in other words, the politicals alone, an average of 28,000 executions per month for that period, for the whole Soviet Union. But at how many different locations were executions being carried out? A figure of 150 would be very modest. There were more, of course. In Sikov alone, the NKVD set up torture and execution chambers in the basements of many churches, in former hermit cells, and even in 1953, tourists were still not allowed into these churches on the grounds that archives were kept there. The cobwebs hadn't been swept up for 10 years at a stretch. Those were the archives they kept there. and before beginning restoration work on these churches, they had to haul away the bones of them by the truckload. On the basis of his calculation, an average of 6 people were shot in the course of one day at each execution site. What's so fantastic about that? It is even an understatement. According to other sources, 1.7 million have been shot by January 1st, 1939. During the years of World War II, the use of capital punishment was occasionally extended for various reasons, as for example by the militarization of the railroads, and at times was broadened as to method. From April 1943 on, for example, with the decree on hanging. All of these events delayed to a certain extent the promised full, final, and perpetual repeal of the death penalty. However, the patience and loyalty of our people finally earned them this reward. In May 1947, Josef Vissarionovich inspected his new starched dickie in his mirror, liked it, and dictated to the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet the decree on the abolition of capital punishment in peacetime, replacing it with a new maximum term of 25 years. It was a good pretext for the introducing of the so-called quarter. But our people are ungrateful, criminal, and incapable of appreciating generosity. Therefore, after the rulers had creaked along and eked out 2.5 years without the death penalty, on January 12, 1950, a new decree was published that constituted an about-face. In view of petitions pouring in from the national republics, Ukraine, from the trade unions, oh, those lovely trade unions, they always know what's needed, from peasant organizations, this was dictated by a sleepwalker. The gracious sovereign had stomped to death all peasant organizations way back in the year of the Great Turning Point, and also from cultural leaders. Now that is quite likely. Capital punishment was restored for a conglomeration of traitors of the motherland, spies, and subversive diversionists. And of course, they forgot to repeal the quarter, the 25-year sentence, which remained in force. And once this return to our familiar friend, to our beheading blade, had begun, things went further with no effort at all. In 1954, for premeditated murder. In May 1961, for theft of state property and counterfeiting and terrorism in places of imprisonment. This was directed especially at prisoners who killed informers and terrorized the camp administration. In July 1961, for violating the rules governing foreign currency transactions. In February 1962, for threatening the lives of, shaking a fist at, policemen or communist vigilantes, the so-called druzhniki, then for rape, and immediately thereafter for bribery. But all of this is simply temporary until complete abolition. And that's how it's described today too. And so it turns out that Russia managed longest of all without capital punishment in the reign of the Empress Elizabeth Petrovna. Thank you for listening. Have a good night.